challenge of audio engineering, or the task of the audio engineer, is to try to recreate what happens in a live environment when you're in a room listening to a band. Try to make little cones of paper somehow recreate that sonic experience in at home or on a laptop or with earbuds. So the audio engineer has to use all the tools that he or she has available to them to translate what's happening in the studio with the musicians into some form of recorded medium for everyone else to enjoy. It's certainly not an easy job, and much like director of a film or a photographer it's not as easy as just pointing and shooting. They have to work on spacing and lighting and all sorts of things that I don't understand. In order to make the image compelling, the audio engineer has to use mic techniques and so choosing the right microphones, the right amplifiers in consoles, putting the musicians in the right room, and balancing levels and frequencies in order to present the musical event in the best possible light. It's necessary because, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a microphone itself is not the same as our ear. Our ear is attached to our brain, thankfully, and with that wonderful marriage, we can do things like direct our attention. We can, when we listen to things, we can focus our attention on what it is we're most interested in and ignore a lot of the other extraneous noise. A microphone hears everything. So it's not as simple as just throwing a microphone in front of a musician and having it come out sounding like you were there. It requires a very careful consideration of lots of different equipment requirements and working within the confines of the technology and acoustics in order to try to give the listener the same kind of experience as if they were in that room. So the steps that an audio engineer takes in the process of recording a band goes in 3 phases, essentially. First, you record the basic elements. This usually includes the drums and bass. You capture the rhythm section by setting them up in a big studio and miking up all the individual elements. And we record all of those elements on separate tracks in the computer or on a tape machine. Each microphone gets its own lane that can be manipulated by the engineer at various stages throughout the process. So after the first stage of recording bed tracks, or basic tracks we call them, you move into the second stage, which is called overdubbing. And what that means is once the initial elements are already recorded, we go through and add extra elements. So we might add acoustic guitars or lead instruments, the vocal, all sorts of different other elements, probably one thing at a time, to try to build what will end up being the final product. In certain styles of music like jazz, you might not do any overdubs at all. You might just capture the band in its entirety all at once. But with the advent of computer technology, we've found ourselves going more methodically through the recording process. It makes everything easier on the technical end if you can focus on one instrument at a time. So after recording bed tracks and overdubs, we move into the third stage of the whole recording process, and that's called mixing. Mixing is one of the most creative parts of the job of the audio engineer, and it involves taking all of the basic ingredients that you've recorded up until that point and combining them together in such a way that it becomes compelling for the listener to listen to. This is really where everything comes together. Think of, if there's a cooking analogy, then when the chef goes and collects all the ingredients necessary, mixing is when they finally put it together and make it delicious. well, through every part of the process, as much as we don't like to admit it, thinking that a good audio engineer can change the world. The most important thing is a great musician. Most of the best sounding, a lot of the best sounding records that have ever been made had the greatest musicians playing, so that certainly will make the engineer's job easier. But having a great drummer, for example, playing his instrument or her instrument extraordinarily well, and one that sounds great, so depending on the drums themselves, the engineer has to place that instrument in the room properly, so that surprisingly, no matter where you move the drum kit within a room, it will drastically change the sound of every element of that drum kit. So after finding the right human to play the drums, the right drum kit to play, and placing it in the right position, the job becomes a matter of choosing the right weapons for the job. So we have a number of different types of microphones, different sizes of microphones that have different strengths and weaknesses. We have dynamic microphones that can handle loud sounds very well, but by the same token aren't extraordinarily sensitive, so they don't give us much detail, but they're really good for capturing loud, explosive sounds like drums. If you on your home stereo, you would likely have a bigger part of the speaker and one smaller part. And the bigger part, as you are likely aware, is where the bass comes from, and the smaller part is where a lot of the higher frequencies, the treble, comes from. And interestingly enough, when you choose a microphone, the size of the microphone, the size of the diaphragm, we call it the diaphragm, it's the thing that moves back and forth to translate acoustic energy into electric impulses. The size of the diaphragm dictates how much low frequency that microphone can handle. So on a kick drum, the bass drum, an engineer will usually reach for a large diaphragm microphone, something that's pretty big and can capture a lot of bottom end. We have other types of microphones called condenser microphones, and they use a fancy technology that floats the diaphragm fictionless in space, which means it's much freer to move back and forth, which translates into a greater ability to capture detail in high frequency sounds. So if you wanted a vocalist to sound like they were singing in your ear and you could hear every nuance of their performance, then a condenser microphone might be the right choice, because it is very sensitive and picks up everything, including the sound of their lips smacking together. So once the engineer decides which microphones to use on any particular instrument, he or she would go about trying out different instruments, different mics on different instruments, and it's quite surprising how drastic a change you'll find between different microphones. So hopefully trial and error is involved, and the engineer will experiment on choosing the right match. Every voice is different and every microphone is different, so the best microphone in the world isn't necessarily the best microphone for every individual. Once all the tracks are recorded onto separate tracks, we can bring them into various pieces of equipment, whether it's in a computer or on a console. Each microphone is split up into a separate line on the console, and that channel strip ends up giving us the ability to manipulate that particular sound in a number of different ways. We can change the equalization of the sound, so your stereo at home would have a treble and bass knob. That's a very basic form of equalization. We have a more detailed variety of that same thing here, so we can go through and customize every sound that we've captured, hoping to make them blend together incredibly well. With the console, we have, obviously we can change the volume of the individual elements, so we can work on the balance of all the instruments within the mix. We can dictate where in the stereo spectrum that instrument sits on each channel strip. And we can do a number of other things, including sending each singular instrument to different effects or different processors, different things like reverberation and delay, so that we can add an element of dimension, essentially, to our mix, because it's not always ideal to have it sound like every element of the mix is right in front of your face. Sometimes if we can create a three-dimensional space between the two speakers, then we can draw the listener in more and hopefully keep them entertained. In the process of mixing, when we add the element of dimension, the goal is to try to make it sound like each instrument or part exists in a space. Now, there are times when the instrument was recorded in a space that sounds really good. Sometimes we put drums in a big room and we mic the room up and it sounds big and great. Other times we put a microphone in front of something and it ends up sounding very close to us, and what we want to do is use artificial reverberation to push that sound further back in the mix, or to make it sound like every element was in the same room at the same time. So reverb units exist in the computer as well as in the analog domain, and it's just a matter of choosing the size of the room, the length of time that it takes for a sound to decay in the room, taking into account the tempo of the song and the sense of space that you're trying to create. Another tool that we use is delay. Delay, simply put, is a repeat, an echo. So when something gets repeated a number of times, that's delay. Delay was first used with tape machines, complicated routing of tape machines back to themselves, and that gave us a warm quality to the echo. The echo didn't sound exactly like the original, and often that's something we try to recreate in the digital domain, having the second and third repeat sound a little bit more, have more character, so it sits behind the original. And these are things that the average listener probably wouldn't pay attention to, but would miss if they weren't there. After the entire process is done, after the audio engineer has mixed the record, where we had all the individual tracks to play with, it's combined to a stereo mix, which just means it's the same kind of scenario as any WAV file or MP3 that you've heard, in that there's one channel that goes to the left speaker and one that goes to the right speaker. But that stereo mix has one more step to get through before it makes its way to the duplicating plant or to the internet. And that last step is called mastering. And mastering is a little bit of a mystery to many people, because in basic terms, it's very simple elements. The mastering engineer is using the same kind of tools that we use throughout the process, but the difference is that the mastering engineer is only working with the stereo mix, not any individual tracks. And that stereo mix, once the mastering engineer is working to make that mix translate well across any number of sound systems. So while the mixing engineer might focus on combining everything together and making it sound great in the room that he or she is working in, the mastering engineer's job is to make sure that it stands up to other music that gets played on the radio, that any overall volume issues are dealt with so that it sounds as good on a laptop speaker system as it does on a huge sound system, within reason. And the last step for the mastering engineer is to put the songs together in the order that they're going to appear on the album or the compact disc, and you do things like dictate the space between songs and do fade outs and stuff like that.